Are you ready? Should we start now?
Yes, please, Dika.
Alright.
Yes.
Baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian, sebelum saya mulai, kami menyediakan interpreter ke bahasa Indonesia yang fiturnya bisa digunakan oleh para audiens di sini dengan menekan tombol interpretation yang berbentuk bola dunia di bawah dan memilih channel Japanese. Maaf, nggak ada Indonesia, jadinya Bapak Ibu sekalian bisa pilih channel Japanese. Nanti Bapak Ibu sekalian akan mendengar terjemahan bahasa Indonesia melalui channel tersebut. And vice versa, for those of you who need language translation into English, please select English channel on the interpretation button. I hope, Lindsay, you are familiar with this feature on Zoom and can follow the discussion or the question that probably will be delivered in Bahasa Indonesia. Well, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat malam, selamat pagi, waktu Washington DC. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Selamat datang di diskusi virtual Perludem, Keamanan Siber Pemilu Amerika Serikat di tengah pandemi. Ini adalah diskusi ketiga sebetulnya dalam seri diskusi jelang Pemilu Amerika Serikat. Pada dua diskusi sebelumnya, kami membahas hal yang general begitu ya, seperti sistem politik, sistem pemilu, dan beberapa isu politik terkini dari kacamata scholar Indonesia. Waktu itu ada Jayadi Hanan, dosen studi kawasan Amerika pada Universitas Paramadina, dan juga ada rekan Perludem Miftah Sabri, dia analis politik yang waktu itu berbasis di Chicago. Nah, kali ini kita akan membahas pemilu Amerika Serikat dari sudut pandang yang lebih spesifik, yaitu keamanan siber, langsung dari ahlinya. Kami menghadirkan Lindsay Forson, Direktur Program Keamanan Siber pada National Association of Secretaries of State, atau yang biasa disingkat dengan NAS. Nanti pemaparan dari Lindsay Forson akan dilakukan dalam bahasa Inggris. Sekali lagi kami menyediakan interpreter ke bahasa Indonesia yang fiturnya bisa digunakan oleh para audiens di sini dengan menekan tombol interpretation yang berbentuk bola dunia dan memilih channel Japanese. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this discussion would not have happened without the support of the U.S. Embassy Jakarta. So before the discussion, I would like to invite Mr. Leo Jok to open this event. Leo is Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer in U.S. Embassy Jakarta. Leo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dika. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for ending your week with us here on Friday night. And it's my privilege today to share the virtual stage with a United States elections and cybersecurity expert, Lindsay Forson, Director of Cybersecurity Programs for the National Association of Secretaries of State, for a conversation on state preparations for the 2020 U.S. presidential election. I'll keep my remarks brief because our expert moderator and many of you who are also experts on these themes in the audience have important questions, I'm sure, for Lindsay. But in brief, in 2016, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, notified 21 American states that Russia had targeted their election systems and voter databases. Fortunately, in most cases, these hacks were unsuccessful. Nevertheless, in early 2017, DHS designated the U.S. elections infrastructure as a critical infrastructure, putting it in the same category as our nuclear power and defense production infrastructures. The Secretary of Homeland Security at that time, Jay Johnson, announced, and I quote, "Now more than ever, it is important that we offer our assistance to state and local election officials in the cybersecurity of their systems. Election infrastructure is vital to our national interests, and cyber attacks on this country are becoming more sophisticated, and bad cyber actors ranging from nation states, cyber criminals, and hacktivists are becoming more sophisticated and dangerous. Ms. Forson can speak to how the United States has made our elections infrastructure more robust and resilient since the 2016 elections. But this discussion on cybersecurity and elections, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think speaks to the challenges that our countries face, both the United States and Indonesia as democratic societies during this unprecedented time. It also underlines the core values and the fundamental rights that citizens of the US and citizens of Indonesia share, in this case, the right to vote in free and fair elections. In the digital age, guaranteeing electoral integrity means robust voting technology, robust cyber risk management, and protection against intrusions by malign actors. And by raising awareness of the role of open networks and secure networks in democratic elections and processes, I hope we can counter the threat of cyber intrusions from those bad actors that would threaten the fundamentals of our democratic societies. But before we begin, I also wanted to give my deep thanks to our hosting organization, Perludem, to Bu Ninis and Padika, not only for hosting this event and partnering for us on this program, but also for the work that your organization does to promote free and fair elections and to promote education and voter participation throughout Indonesia. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pak Leo, for the remark. It's a pleasure to collaborate with you and all the folks at US Embassy Jakarta, and we wish you a successful election ahead. And selanjutnya, saya undang Mbak Ninis Hoirunisa Nur Agustiati, Direktur Eksekutif Perkumpulan untuk Pemilu dan Demokrasi, untuk juga memberikan sambutan pembuka untuk diskusi kita hari ini. Kepada Mbak Ninis, dipersilakan.
Baik, terima kasih Dika. Good morning for our Indonesian audience, and good morning to Ibu Lindsay. Mudah-mudahan kita selalu sehat ya dalam situasi seperti ini. Selalu diberikan kesehatan, diberikan keamanan juga. Pertama, ketika Pak Leo mengontak gitu ya, menawarkan apakah Perludem berminat untuk kita sharing ya, kita punya sharing bareng berkaitan dengan pemilu Amerika Serikat. Kami senang sekali karena seperti yang tadi Dika sampaikan, sebelumnya kita sudah pernah 2 kali ya melakukan diskusi tentang pemilu Amerika, karena sebetulnya di Indonesia sendiri banyak yang ingin belajar terkait dengan pemilu di Amerika ya, seluk-beluknya seperti apa. Dan kali ini kita membahas salah satu isu yang tidak kalah penting terkait dengan keamanan cybernya, bahwa ini saya rasa bukan hanya permasalahan yang ada di Amerika Serikat ya, di Indonesia juga punya permasalahan yang sama, apalagi kita belum punya kerangka hukum yang firm ya terkait dengan penggunaan teknologi dalam pemilu. Harapannya momen ini bisa di sharing session untuk kita semua. Saya lihat di sini pesertanya ada teman-teman dari penyelenggara pemilu, ada dari civil society, ada dari media, yang ini baik sekali ya untuk kita nanti bisa saling berdiskusi. Mungkin itu saja Dika dari saya. Sekali lagi terima kasih Pak Leo, Bu Lindsay atas kesediaannya, dan untuk teman-teman yang lainnya selamat berdiskusi, selamat malam.
Selamat malam, terima kasih Mbak Ninis. Saya kira benar tadi diskusi mengenai situasi keamanan siber pemilu Amerika Serikat ini tentu nanti akan sangat berguna bagi audiens Indonesia untuk memahami begitu ya dan mempelajari ancaman siber apa saja yang sudah terjadi, kemudian sedang terjadi di masa pandemi ini, dan mungkin nanti akan terjadi pada pemilu di masa depan. Well, without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Lindsay Forson. Lindsay Forson is the Director of Cyber Security Programs for the National Association of Secretaries of State, or NAS in brief. NAS membership is made up of secretaries of state from the 50 states. Secretaries of State have varying responsibilities, including state management of voter registration and election administration, state business services, state archive, and more. Ms. Lindsay managed the association's relationships related to cybersecurity and election security, facilitate cybersecurity information sharing among NAS members and their staff, and staffs the NAS Cybersecurity Committee. Ms. Lindsay also has a master's degrees and a PhD in public administration and public policy from Auburn University. Her research is focused on intergovernmental relation, security, and emergency management issues within U.S. election administration. She has also previous experience in congressional affairs and higher education. Well, good morning, Ms. Lindsay. I hope you are doing well in this strange time.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. I hope you are doing well in this time as well.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Ms. Lindsay, in the final debate between President Trump and Joe Biden last night, there's one section of the debate about election security that we will discuss tonight. The section of the debate began with the news announced Wednesday by the US government that Iran and Russia had taken action to interfere with the election, ranging from obtaining voter registration, it already mentioned by Pak Leo, to sending emails meant to intimidate American voters and sow unrest. The two countries took specific action to also manipulate public opinion regarding the election, particularly on the internet. In your opinion, how is election more secure in 2020, and how is voting technology more secure in 2020? How many states that still use vulnerable voting machine system or internet connected election system? Ms. Lindsay, you have 30 minutes for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I will do my best to address those questions throughout the presentation. I'm also happy to take additional questions at the end, of course, when we get to Q&A. Is somebody going to pull up the presentation?
Ya, Mas Ian, bisa dibantu untuk tampilkan presentasinya?
Great, and I'll go ahead and get started while you're doing that. As was said multiple times during the introduction, my name is Lindsay Forson. I am the Director of Cybersecurity Programs for the National Association of Secretaries of State, or NAS, as we call ourselves, since our name is so very long. And I'm going to today discuss state preparations for the 2020 US elections. I will focus particularly on election security and specifically on election cybersecurity, but I will also address broader efforts in response to the COVID pandemic and other things as well. You can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So just to tell you a little bit about my organization, NAS. NAS is an organization that represents secretaries of state throughout the US. Our membership is open to the 50 states, as well as DC and the US territories. And most participate in the association. 40 of our members serve as their state's chief election official, and that's a legal designation. The state chief election official, the role varies a little bit from state to state, but all of them have a role in overseeing voter registration in their states and overseeing election administration for the entire state. So that's obviously the role of NAS members that we're going to discuss today. Secretaries of state do a range of other things as well. And so our members who aren't their state's chief election official handle other important state government tasks like registering businesses and managing state archives and a number of other things as well. In the states where our member is not the state chief election official, there's a different government structure who is in charge of elections for that state. It's usually a board or commission, and they are represented by an association called the National Association of State Election Directors. And NAS and NASED, the National Association of State Election Directors, work very closely together. NASED also has members who work within our members' offices as their state's election director. So NAS sees our main role as being a platform for information sharing across the states. Because of our system of government in the United States, there are a lot of responsibilities and roles that are at the state level. And so it's really important those states run their own elections, and they come up with their own rules and processes to be able to share information across the states, to be able to share lessons learned with each other and share ideas and promising practices that one state is implementing that may be useful to others. So we see that as our primary role, and we also foster cooperation in the development of public policy through coming up with policy positions among our members. NAS has key initiatives related to elections and cybersecurity, and those initiatives are mostly in terms of information sharing, again, across the state, and education and relationship building with outside entities. Okay, you can move on to the next slide. So now I will get into, you really can't talk about anything in US elections without kind of laying a groundwork for how elections are operated here in the US, because it is very different from the way that elections are run in most other countries. The US election system is really a system of systems. There are election systems in each state, at the state level, and then multiple within those states at the local government level. Election administration is extremely decentralized in the United States. It is not run by the federal government. So we have 50 states that run their own elections, and the territories run their own elections. And even within those states, so there's some statewide authority, and really the legislative authority for creating laws around elections primarily lies at the state level. So it is mostly state legislatures and other legislative bodies at the state level that form the rules for elections for each individual state. There are some federal laws that relate to election administration, but primarily that is a state responsibility. What is a local, even more decentralized, the actual administration of elections, so implementing these rules and laws, is a local government responsibility primarily in the United States. So when I say local government, I'm talking about counties within most states, and within some states, I'm talking about cities, municipalities, townships, other local government jurisdictions. So across the United States, there are more than 8,000 local election jurisdictions that run their own elections. And so you can see there are a lot of different people involved in US election administration, well over 10,000 election administrators in the United States. And the rules, because the rules are mostly set at the state level, the rules and processes vary across the 50 states. In some cases, they vary significantly. Elections, for example, in Massachusetts look very different from the way elections are run on the West Coast in Oregon. And elections in California look pretty different from elections in Alabama, and you could go on and on. There are significant differences in the way that elections are run at the state level, and that is mostly comes down to state culture and the way that state laws were created in response to specific state cultures. And even within the states, the processes vary. So local government election administrators have discretion over how to do certain things. And so some states, you'll see even within that state, some processes that may happen in one city or one county and not in another. The biggest reason for that is very large cities, very large metropolitan areas have different needs than smaller, more rural areas. And so sometimes there are different election processes in those areas to respond to the needs of individual voters in those areas. NAS has a website called canivote.org, which is where we push voters out to their specific states. So because elections are so decentralized, voters really have to go to their own state and in some cases their own local government to get information about the election. And so the canivote.org is a website run by NAS where a voter can go and they can select their state and get election information directly from the election official in that state. You can find more information on our website, nas.org, nass.org, about all of these things that I'm discussing. If you go to nas.org, we have an initiatives tab on the homepage, which is where you can go to all of the different initiatives I will be discussing today. This particular one is election administration. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, and so election cybersecurity, of course, a critically important topic for any democracy. As we know, a free and fair election is the cornerstone of a democracy, and protecting the integrity of those elections from any threats is critically important. And the state election officials see this as among their most important responsibilities right now. As Leo said in the introduction, the 2016 elections were targeted by Russia, by a foreign adversary, in a number of ways, through influence operations, as well as some cyber targeting of campaigns and some cyber targeting of government election infrastructure. So the conclusion, so Leo mentioned the 21 states that were contacted by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to let them know that their election systems had been scanned by entities representing the Russian government. Our understanding at this point is that most likely election systems in all 50 states were scanned or probed by Russian actors. And really the most important thing is that all 50 states do see themselves as a target for adversaries in cyberspace. So they are all working to manage the risk to their election systems. In response to the events of the 2016 election, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, as you might hear me refer to them, designated elections as critical infrastructure. And the critical infrastructure of the United States is that infrastructure that is vital to national and economic security. So they made that designation, which really led to the need and the desire for increased collaboration across the layers of government within the United States. So the federal government, state government, and local government. I'm sorry, I have something popping up. Okay, so initially, early on in the implementation of the designation, the relationships between the federal government and the state and local election administrators was the coordination was not perfect. It was not smooth. These entities had no history of working with each other. And so in some cases, there were communication failures. The federal government really didn't even know who to contact in the states about this Russian targeting. And so there were a lot of lessons learned early on in implementing this critical infrastructure designation. We have come a long way since 2017. And at this point, there is drastically increased intergovernmental coordination between the federal government, state governments, and local governments. And we really have productive relationships. The state governments and NAS have an extremely productive relationship with the Department of Homeland Security. And we communicate at this point definitely daily, but even when we're not so close to an election, we communicate very regularly between the levels of government. We've also increased coordination with some nonprofit associations who support elections in the United States, as well as private sector technology providers. A big part of this was the establishment of what is called the Election Infrastructure Subsector Government Coordinating Council, or the GCC. The Government Coordinating Council was established in response to the critical infrastructure designation. And this is a formal body that exists with leaders in election security from the federal government, state governments, and local governments to really coordinate efforts. And the GCC has come up with protocols for cyber threat and incident information sharing across the United States. They've come up with plans for creating risk management frameworks to assist state and local election administrators. They've come up with election administration training in cybersecurity. They work on a variety of issues, really coordinating across the United States on cybersecurity. There's also a sector coordinating council, which represents some of those private sector technology providers and some nonprofit organizations who are involved in the election security space. And so now they are coordinating with one another at unprecedented levels. And the GCC and SCC are coordinating with each other more as well. One of the biggest, most important accomplishments of the GCC was the establishment of the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the EIISAC. And the EIISAC is a organization through which we share cybersecurity information in the United States. And so it's the main role of the EIISAC is for all of the, like I said, we have more than 10,000 people involved in really as leaders involved in administering elections throughout the United States, and more than 8,000 specific government entities who are running elections in the United States. And so we really needed a mechanism for sharing information. So all of these election administrators can push information into the EIISAC. So if they see a particular threat, cyber threat, or if they have an actual incident or they suspect an incident, they can report information into the EIISAC. And the EIISAC will analyze information. They will look for trends and report key information back out to all of the members of the EIISAC. All 50 states are members of the EIISAC, as well as about 3,000 local election officials. And those locals who are not members of the EIISAC are often receiving the relevant information through their state's chief election official. So the EIISAC they have other roles as well, including assisting election officials with cyber incident response, providing some training. They have a number of services that they provide related to cybersecurity risk management, but their primary role is facilitating this information sharing, and it really has increased the information sharing across election administration entities in the United States. There have also been a lot of individual state government and local government efforts to safeguard the systems, the people, and the processes involved in election administration. we see election cybersecurity as really a multifaceted issue. It's a systems problem, right? We have to secure systems, but we also have to secure people and processes. This is all of these are important aspects of this, and the state and local governments have been involved in securing and focused on securing all of these different elements of the election administration process. The systems, first of all, so you can think about there are a range of systems involved in election administration in the United States. Some of those are by nature connected to the internet. They have to be because they're open to the public. So there we're thinking about things like election information websites, including websites that tell voters the information they need to register to vote and where to go to vote, when they can vote, those sorts of things. And then there are also websites that report out election results. Starting on election night, they report out unofficial results before they're certified, and we call those election night reporting systems. There are voter registration systems where voter registration data for the state is housed, and local governments interact with those systems. Most states have online voter registration where individual citizens can go and register to vote online. So a lot of these election systems are internet connected, and so and those are additionally systems that we have seen targeted. And so there is a lot of focus on securing those systems, managing the risk to those systems. Of course, you can never create a perfect system. So this process is about assessing where the risk lies and prioritizing the resources you have to manage the most significant risks to these systems, and then build in backup processes to make the systems resilient, even if an incident were to occur. So some of the things that they have been doing is, for example, implementing two-factor authentication. So not just a password to access the statewide voter registration system, but also another means of authentication, such as a physical token. They have been working on updating systems, both online or internet connected systems, as well as the voting systems, which I will talk about in just a minute. But upgrading to new software, we have definitely increased our information sharing about software vulnerabilities, and so applying fixes to software vulnerabilities more quickly. States are constantly receiving information about this and applying fixes to their software, as well as sharing this information with their local governments. And there are a range of other cybersecurity best practices that they are implementing to protect these systems. They're also, as I said, creating resilience in the process. So having offline backups of these voter registration systems, so that if something were to occur, they have these systems being regularly backed up, and they can pick up with the backup. I didn't mention electronic poll books, which is a system through which voters are checked in at a polling station, and sometimes these can be connected systems. Often they're not connected systems, but still, whether there's a cyber incident or a technology malfunction, most election officials are implementing paper backups, so also having a paper poll book to check in individuals if something were to happen with that electronic poll book. So it's both about risk management and resilience. Other systems that I didn't mention as much are the vote casting and vote tabulation systems. So these are the systems that voters actually interact with when they go into a polling location to vote in person. And in some cases, they could they would not interact with them when they're voting by mail. They would then mail in the vote or mail in the ballot or bring the ballot to a drop-off location. But these systems, in some cases, what I was going to say is there are options for certain voters to mark their ballots through internet connected systems, but they're typically still printing out a ballot and bringing it in somewhere or mailing it in. So these systems are a range of systems. In many states and localities, what the voter is doing is they're hand marking their paper ballot with a pen, and then they're feeding that ballot through a tabulator. And so that would be the vote tabulation system in those cases. In other cases, they are casting their votes on or recording their votes is a better word to use, on a touchscreen device, what we call, a ballot marking device. And then the ballot marking device will print out their votes. They can verify their votes on there, and then feed them through a scanner or a tabulator. So these are the systems. You hear these systems get a lot of attention, but there's certainly not all there is to election security. There are other systems that are even higher risk, and election officials really have to focus on security measures for all of them. Related to these voting systems, a big focus of election officials over the last 4 years has been making sure that there is some paper component in that process. So they're not just touching a screen and their vote is being recorded. If they're touching a screen, a paper ballot's being printed out, or they're hand marking a paper ballot in most cases. Related to people, as I said, there are a lot of people involved in election administration. And so there has been a huge effort to train individuals on cybersecurity awareness and train them on the resources that are available to them. So training local election officials on the resources that are available to them at the state level and from the federal government and EISAC has been a big focus over the past 4 years. Certainly a challenge in the US election system related to cybersecurity is that we do have more than 8,000 local election jurisdictions, and in some cases, this introduces resilience to the system, but it also, there are varying levels of resources and levels of cybersecurity expertise across these 8,000 jurisdictions, and in some cases, there's just one person in a city or county who is who's in charge of administering elections, and they may even work part-time, and they may not have a lot of cybersecurity expertise. So a huge focus at the state level has been assisting local governments with cybersecurity. Several states set up programs that many of them call a Cyber Navigator program, where they hire a cybersecurity expert at the state level or multiple cybersecurity experts at the state level. And those individuals actually go out into the local governments and they provide boots on the ground cybersecurity support to counties and cities. And they help the local governments assess the risk to their systems, and they help them prioritize their resources to manage risk. And then processes, of course, a big part of securing the processes is creating awareness. And there have also been other security practices introduced to election processes, such as stronger auditing of election systems, stronger, in some cases, certification of systems at the state level, auditing of election results. So there have been a lot of election security process practices introduced as well. And again, if you go to nas.org and you go to initiatives, there is a Securing Election initiative there, where you can see more about some examples of what specific states are working on. You can move on to the next slide. Of course, another big challenge, which is somewhat related, is election misinformation and disinformation. And it's related to cybersecurity, though different in some ways, because this is often happening on the internet. and also because it is in many cases the same adversaries who are targeting elections through cyber means, as well as through trying to influence the opinions of US voters and create chaos in the election process by introducing inaccurate information. So countering election mis and disinformation is probably a more challenging problem to address for election officials than cybersecurity. Because cybersecurity, there are specific risk management practices that are recommended by a range of cybersecurity experts that can be implemented. Related to election mis and disinformation, there is the issue of freedom of speech in the United States. So election officials have to be very careful about the ways in which they attempt to address this challenge. And misinformation, where sometimes people are providing inaccurate information about elections, not maliciously, not on purpose, is a huge challenge in addition to disinformation, where adversaries are intentionally and maliciously introducing incorrect information about elections. So election officials, when it comes to election misinformation and disinformation, the role of election officials is primarily to address information related to the actual election process. So information about registering to vote, how, when, and where to register to vote, how, when, and where to vote, information about the security of the systems. That is the information that you will usually see election officials address. Most of them do not see a role for themselves in terms of addressing information about candidates, political issues, and political parties. So related to addressing the election information about the election process, some of the things election officials are doing to address misinformation and disinformation is forging relationships with the social media companies. NAS specifically has created relationships with a lot of the major social media companies, including Facebook and Twitter and some others. And in creating mechanisms for election officials to directly report inaccurate information about the election to the platforms. There's also increased information sharing about inaccurate election information across the election administration community. And that is happening both through formal and informal mechanisms where election officials are just picking up the phone and calling each other, but as well as through the EIISAC, though the EIISAC is mostly for sharing information about cybersecurity threats. State and local election officials can also report election misinformation and disinformation to the EIISAC. So again, the EIISAC can look for trends and things that may be happening in multiple states or multiple localities and report that information out to election officials. New this year, the EIISAC has an initiative through which election officials can report election misinformation and disinformation directly to the EIISAC, and the EIISAC will take care of reporting that information to the social media the social media platforms. So, if there is misinformation and disinformation right around election day, when election officials are laser focused on administering the election, they can report to a single source who will then take care of the reporting. NAS has an initiative through which we try to combat election misinformation and disinformation, and that is our #TrustedInfo2020 initiative. You can look up the hashtag TrustedInfo2020 on social media and see some of those efforts. And this initiative is really about encouraging voters to go straight to their state and local election officials for information about the election, to get that information directly from the source to ensure that it is accurate and up to date. And it's also an initiative on the part of the state election officials to be regularly sharing this information with their voters through multiple mechanisms. And so there's really been increased effort on the part of state election officials to make sure they're just regularly sharing any updates to the election process and just all of the important information about how to register and how to vote with their voters on a regular basis. And again, NAS and many Trusted Info 2020 partners are encouraging voters to go straight to their election officials for this information. And this is a good transition into the next topic I'm going to discuss, because it is incredibly important. We launched the Trusted Info 2020 initiative long before we knew about COVID-19, but the pandemic has made it even more important of an initiative. And that is because election rules and processes have changed in many cases in response to the initiative. Many states have expanded options for voting, or they've, in some cases, expanded dates for voting, or they've, in some cases, changed the voter registration deadline to accommodate all of the mail voting that is occurring this year. And so the information has changed. In some cases, it may change more closer to the election than usual if an election official has to, for example, move a polling location in response to the pandemic. So for that reason, it's even more important that voters are going straight to the election official for their information, because it may have changed. And you can move on to the next slide. So elections during COVID, and of course, cybersecurity and mis and disinformation are part of this, but there's a lot of election administration challenges raised by the pandemic. And I could talk about this for hours. So just to try to sum up some of the things that have happened here, states have, as I mentioned, made some modifications to election rules and processes. In many cases, states have expanded what they call absentee voting. So voting, which was traditionally for voters who are unavailable to vote in person on election day, but many states have expanded that definition since then, as well as early voting in person. So going to a polling location before election day to cast your ballot in person, or voting by mail, which can mean receiving a ballot by mail in most cases, marking your ballot, and then either returning it by mail or returning it either to a drop box location or a drop off location, usually at an office. So many states and localities have expanded these processes. And if you're following media reporting around the election, we have a lot of voters taking advantage of these options this year and casting their ballots before election day. There are also health and safety measures being taken at the polling locations for voters who choose to go cast their ballot in person. So, you know, a lot of things, PPE for the election workers, requiring election workers to wear masks, face shields in some case, putting up plexiglass partitions between election workers and voters, having hand sanitizer in the polling location or hand washing stations for voters, having single-use pins or marking devices for voters, separating voters by 6 feet or more when they wait in line. A lot of these processes are being implemented for in-person voting. There has been increased intergovernmental coordination around COVID implications for elections, and really what was put in place through the critical infrastructure designation and the efforts of state and local election officials to increase their coordination, both across levels of government and within states with different state entities such as emergency managers or state chief information officers or governors. That has really laid a foundation that made this increased intergovernmental coordination around COVID happen much more smoothly. So we already had mechanisms for sharing information related to cybersecurity, and we were able to use those same mechanisms to share information related to administering elections during COVID. So through the Election Government Coordinating Council, election officials were able to collaborate not only with the Department of Homeland Security, but also with the Election Assistance Commission, who they regularly collaborate with as well, who provides assistance to state and local election officials, as well as with the Center for Disease Control to receive information about the pandemic and how to protect voters and election workers, as well as increased coordination with the United States Postal Service, because as I mentioned, we are likely to see them playing an increased role, and we're already seeing that in the administration of this election. And if you go to nas.org, we have an icon right on our homepage that is related to elections during COVID-19, where we talk more about individual state efforts. Okay, you can move to the next slide. And that's all I had in terms of presentation. So let's move on to the fun part of question and answer.
Baik, terima kasih Lindsay atas paparannya. Saya kira tadi sudah komprehensif sekali penjelasan tentang keamanan siber dari mulai upaya-upaya atau inisiatif-inisiatif untuk menjaga sistem gitu ya, atau teknologi yang digunakan. Kemudian sumber daya manusianya juga dan prosesnya. Tadi juga dibahas soal misinformasi dan disinformasi yang masuk melalui sosial media platform ya. Ini juga saya kira jadi concern kita bersama di Indonesia. Ketika kampanye itu dianjurkan beralih ke online dalam konteks pandemi ini, ada banyak sekali potensi risiko yang bisa terjadi yang dapat mempengaruhi kemurnian suara pemilih. Nah, ini kalau tidak ada inisiatif risk management untuk menanggulangi ini, saya kira juga akan berbahaya, gitu ya, akan mempengaruhi integritas pemilu. Saya sudah punya beberapa pertanyaan di sini di kolom Q&A. Bagi yang punya pertanyaan, sekali lagi kami mengundang Bapak Ibu untuk mengetiknya di kolom Q&A, atau kalau mau langsung juga mungkin bisa ya, nanti kami kasih aksesnya untuk menyalakan mikrofon. Tapi pertanyaan yang pertama mungkin saya bacakan dulu dari Q&A box. Ada pertanyaan dari Ibu Betty Idrus, Ketua KPU Provinsi DKI Jakarta. Pertanyaannya, setahu saya Secretary of State adalah jabatan yang dipilih dan berasal dari partai politik. Jika negara bagian memiliki otoritasnya sendiri, bagaimana negara melakukan tanggung jawab supervisi pelaksanaan pemilu di setiap negara bagian? Kemudian bagaimana menjamin penyelenggaraan akan free and fair election sementara panitia utamanya diwakili oleh Secretary of State? Mungkin itu dulu satu pertanyaan, Miss Lindsay.
Great, happy to address that question. So there are a range of ways that secretaries of state are selected. As you mentioned, many of them are elected, and many of them do have a party affiliation in that election, or when they are elected, they do have a party affiliation. They're not all elected. Some of them are appointed by the governor or the legislature, or elected by the legislature. So there's a range of selection processes. In terms of political party, so a state chief election officials must see the role of administering the elections as a nonpartisan role. And NAS has a position to that effect that our members have taken, seeing the actual role of administering the election as a nonpartisan role for secretaries of state and overseeing that process. Beyond that, though, there are, because elections are so decentralized in the United States, there are many people involved in administering the election, and that's probably an important part of addressing the concerns you raised here. So as I mentioned, the Secretary of State is often overseeing the administration of election, but it's local governments who are administering the elections. And so they have local election officials. It completely varies how they are selected, and some of them are elected in partisan elections. Some of them are selected in a range of other ways. But those who are partisan, within any state, you will have local election officials who are Democrats and local election officials who are Republicans, and probably some independents and others as well administering the election. So it is not the Secretary of State who's overseeing the entire process, or they're overseeing the entire process, I'm sorry, but they're not the ones administering the process from beginning to end across the state. Another way is by introducing transparency into the process. So allowing voters to observe different parts of the processes, such as testing the election systems, such as canvassing the election results or verifying the results after the election, such as election audits. So providing that transparency, and there are many steps in that process where states take varying efforts to address any of those concerns. So such as having representatives of both parties, making sure representatives of both parties are there observing the process, in addition to inviting the public to observe certain processes as well. The concern you raise is a concern that we hear. Certain people believe that it is better to make the party affiliation known, because most individuals have ideological leanings, and so some people believe that it's better to make that information known. Some people believe that it would be better for election officials to be nonpartisan, and in some cases, states have made that to be the case. So it really is a difference of opinion on the part of some people, but like I said, in all cases, there are efforts for transparency, and there are many different people involved in these processes to provide checks and balances.
Oke, mungkin lanjut ke pertanyaan yang sedikit berkaitan dengan ini soal kewenangan pemerintah pusat dan pemerintah di negara bagian gitu ya. Kita tahu setelah tahun 2000 saat pemilu Al Gore versus Bush yang banyak sekali ditemukan permasalahan seperti hanging chad pada punch card voting system. Kemudian di tahun 2002 terbit Help Amerika Vote Act yang membuat negara bagian mengganti voting system mesin gitu ya, dan itu beragam pendekatan-pendekatan terhadap itu. Ada yang mengganti dengan DRE, ada yang mengganti dengan hand mark dan nanti di scan gitu ya. Bagaimana sebetulnya kewenangan pemerintah pusat dan masing-masing negara bagian mengatur soal election administration? Kemudian apakah regulasi yang ada sekarang di tiap negara bagian itu cukup memadai gitu ya mengatur soal election administration, terutama soal voting technology. Apa sebetulnya yang perlu diperhatikan dan diatur? And it is related to the question from Muhammad Anis Zafran Al-Anwari. Thank you for the question. Is there any policy that pushed by the federal government to create one strong cybersecurity for the election that could be applied in all over the states? And back in 2016 election, it said that several state election systems were targeted by a foreign country. How much those breaches affected the outcome of the election, and what did the governments do about it? Just accepted the result, or were there any other policies?
Great. So I may have missed something when it switched from translation to not, but I'll do my best to address all of those questions. So in terms of the authority over elections, that comes down to the U.S. Constitution, which gives states authority over determining the time, place, and manner of voting. But it also gives the federal government the authority to alter regulations. So Primarily, like I said, it is states who are establishing the election laws for their own states. But as the example you gave around the Help America Vote Act, the US Congress does have also authority to pass laws related to elections. And for the most part, the laws we've seen to date that were passed by the US Congress tend to relate to access and participation in the elections, things such as the Voting Rights Act as well. So there is a system of dual authority here around establishing rules for U.S. elections. Of course, the Congress, that authority relates to federal elections, not state and local elections in most cases. So I'm trying to make sure I get through all of the parts of this question. So NAS specifically sees, and most state and local election officials see election administration as a state responsibility. We believe that states are the best fit for administering elections for their individual citizens. And so that's important. That's the way elections have been run in the United States. And so our association has traditionally been opposed to what would be seen as federal overreach into state-specific election administration processes. That being said, state election officials are supportive of many of the laws to date that have come from the federal government. Getting into the next part of the Help America Vote Act, yes, in response to the 2000 election, the Help America Vote Act led to state and local governments replacing their voting systems, their vote casting systems and tabulation systems. And they were addressing challenges related to that election. But additionally, probably the way that played out has created some challenges to date because everybody replaced their voting systems at the same time. And some of those systems have cybersecurity challenges, like the DRE that you mentioned, the direct recording electronic system that has without a paper component where the vote's being recorded directly. Now most states who had those systems have now attempted to replace all of them in response to cybersecurity concerns. So states and localities had financial challenges in that they all replaced systems at the same time with the help of federal assistance. And then they all needed to replace them around the same time again, and they didn't have the same kind of federal assistance to replace them. In addition to sometimes establishing laws, the federal government also provides monetary assistance to support state and local election officials in the implementation of elections and the securing of elections. And we have seen that in recent years as well. And that's something that NAS supports is federal money to supplement state and local money to support increasing cybersecurity protection and assisting with other election administration challenges related to securing the election. A challenge around that is the recent money we've seen has been sporadic. So there's no way for election officials to plan for or know when they'll get federal money and to plan for when they'll be able to implement new cybersecurity practices or replace technology based on that money. So state election officials have really pushed for the federal government to provide a regular stream of funding that they can expect and plan around related to securing the elections. This is where I'm not sure that I followed everything, but So related to what occurred in 2016 with the targeting of election systems, and like I said, our assumption at this point is that election systems across the U.S. states were targeted. So what we know, as Leo mentioned, in most cases, there was no actual breach of the systems. So the systems were scanned or probed, but there was no actual breach. In very limited instances, in at least 2 states, there was a breach, but we have no evidence that any data was actually changed. And that is the position of the federal government as well. And so we don't believe the integrity of the election was actually compromised in terms of the manipulation of any data. And further, I think you mentioned specifically were election results changed. So the systems that we saw targeted and in the limited cases breached were not election result tabulation systems or tallying systems. They were voter registration systems in most cases. So, but they were never, that we know of, vote tabulation or systems related to the actual vote count. So we have no evidence that the vote count was manipulated by adversaries.
Well, there is a related question about the result. In terms of auditing, what is the procedure of auditing when allegation of the result exists?
So states have different processes, like everything else in elections. Auditing is there are a lot of different types of auditing in elections. So there's auditing of of processes, auditing of technology, and there's auditing of the tabulation, which I think is what you're referring to here. And so auditing of the tabulation, we've seen a lot of increased efforts since 2016 around post-election tabulation audits. And there are a variety of ways to conduct these audits. And we've seen even states who previously conducted audits make attempts to create more robust and more efficient audits since 2016. But it varies by state, the way that election results are audited. And so in most cases, an audit a post-election tabulation audit would be looking at a sample of ballots to provide confidence that the tabulation is accurate. But there are other processes like actual recount of the votes as well. And so again, the recount processes vary by state. What would initiate a recount of the votes?
Ya, terima kasih atas jawaban-jawabannya. Saya mau undang Bapak Ibu sekalian yang sudah raise hand. Ada Michael Amzali. Apakah masih bersama kami? Saya kasih aksesnya. Halo? Halo? Ya, mungkin saya lanjut ke pertanyaan di chat box, terutama soal misinformasi dan disinformasi. Ada 2 pertanyaan soal itu. Yang pertama masih dari Ibu Betty Idrus. Pertama, bagaimana negara dapat menghalau hoax yang terjadi di media sosial, sejauh apa itu mengganggu para calon yang berkontestasi, dan apakah juga diatur bila ada serangan siber ke lembaga negara yang mengurus pemilu dan juga bahkan web atau media sosial para calon. Kemudian yang berkaitan dengan itu dari Pak Dodi Wijaya, apakah penggunaan rekayasa cyber campaign melalui Cambridge Analytica termasuk pelanggaran pemilu dan bagaimana mengantisipasinya di pemilu kali ini?
I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but I'll do my best to address it. In terms of the influence, how successful the influence is on voters' opinions around candidates, that's really not something I feel comfortable weighing in on. It's just not our role at all related to the political candidates. And I would agree with most people, I think, in saying that is an extremely challenging thing to measure. Somebody mentioned, I think a part of that was a question about if a cyber incident were to occur at the state level. And here I'm talking about cybersecurity incident, not a disinformation campaign against a candidate. So if cyber incidents were to occur, we have, through the Government Coordinating Council, we have protocols. They're voluntary. So, like I said, state elections are run at the state level. So the Government Coordinating Council doesn't have any authority in imposing requirements on state election officials, but we have protocols that state election officials were heavily involved in creating and encouraged the use of on the part of their colleague for reporting this information, as well as for local election officials to report information if there were an incident to federal partners as well as partners within their states. And so that's an important part of this process, so that, you know, if an incident occurs in one state and another state is being targeted with the same thing, so that hopefully we can share the information to prevent additional incidents. And in terms of, you know, like what they do to respond to the incident, that would come down to the individual state incident response plan. Usually they are coordinating with other entities within their states, and they've created incident response plans and done a lot of exercising of these plans for if certain incidents were to occur. So often they would be working with maybe their state's emergency manager, their state's chief information officer. In some cases, there's National Guard units within their states who would help with incident response. Many states would call in members of the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security for assistance, the FBI for investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation for investigation. So states each have their own incident response plans for how they will, depending on what the incident is, respond to a cyber incident in their state. And you would see a lot of similarities across these response plans, especially reflecting those Government Coordinating Council protocols. But based on individual state resources and capabilities, you would also see some differences.
Okay, there's another question about misinformation and disinformation from Pak Hadar Gumai. Great presentation, Lindsay. Thank you. In dealing with mis and disinformation, do you have a policy to take them down? Who has the authority? So far, do you have a number of voters that have used early and postal voting?
I don't have that number. If you look, the individual states and localities are publishing numbers, but again, states have different processes for reporting this information out, and so you would have to look at individual states. The first question was related to getting information taken down. So that's been one reason that forging relationships with the social media platforms directly has been incredibly important. And so the state election officials, local election officials will report what they see as inaccurate information about the election process directly to the social media platforms and request that it be taken down. And we really have seen, there are still some challenges there for sure, but we have seen progress in terms of being able to get inaccurate information about the election taken down more quickly. The challenge is, though, that it's already been seen, right? And so the even more important part is for the election officials to amplify the accurate information that counters the inaccurate narrative.
Bapak Ibu ada yang masih mau ditanyakan? Kami masih membuka sesi Q&A. Bapak Ibu bisa mengetik langsung di Q&A box atau di chat box. Tapi Bapak Ibu sekalian, bagi yang ingin berbicara secara langsung juga tinggal raise hand atau sampaikan di chat. Nanti kami bisa berikan aksesnya untuk berbicara secara langsung, baik itu dalam bahasa Inggris maupun dalam bahasa Indonesia, karena kami punya penerjemah untuk kedua bahasa itu. Ada Bapak Ibu sekalian? Kalau tidak ada, saya mungkin ke pertanyaan dari Mas Eko tadi. Okay, there is a question from Eko Anggoro. Since U.S. election will be conducted during pandemic, what is the approach being used to train election officials, particularly on cyber awareness training and on the implementation of new or updated technology in election on a certain state, if any?
So there are a lot of different efforts going on around training local election officials as well as state election officials on cybersecurity awareness and on implementation of new technology and new practices. I would say, so a lot of these efforts are happening at the state level. So state secretaries of state office, in some cases, they've partnered with their state's IT entity, the state chief information officer. In some cases, they're offering training directly through the Secretary of State's office, but offering a range of training on cybersecurity awareness, particularly around awareness of email phishing campaigns, learning to be extremely critical about emails coming into your inbox and not clicking on links or clicking on attachments from senders you're not familiar with. Also related to implementing additional practices around that. So training users on how to use multi-factor authentication, or how a certain email like filter and quarantine is going to be implemented. Additional to that, a lot of training is about the resources that exist. So state and local election officials have a lot of organizations that they can turn to for assistance in terms of conducting their cybersecurity risk assessments, or responding to an incident, or determining if something suspicious is an incident. And so a big part of the training efforts from states, as well as from the federal government and from a lot of nonprofit associations involved in this space, is related to making sure that local election officials are aware of the resources that are available to them and aware of the help available to them. One specific nonprofit organization is called the Center for Tech and Civic Life, CTCL. They've been doing cybersecurity training for election officials for years. And just this year, they partnered with the Federal Election Assistance Commission to provide that training for free to local election officials. So that's something that's been a recent effort just in the last few months, is trying to get more and more election officials to take that training. So there's training offered by state governments, by the federal government, and a lot of training offered by nonprofit organizations and private sector organizations as well. In addition to training at the state level, there's really an effort to provide assistance, so that one-on-one assistance from a cyber navigator would train the local election officials in being able to do some of these things that their state is helping them with initially on their own. but it's also just direct assistance in helping them conduct assessments and other things like that as well.
Well, thanks. To the next question from Hamdan Safara. What are the toughest challenges for NAS in implementing election cybersecurity in the US? And what is the pattern of supervision and action if there is potential for fraud or cybercrime?
So NAS, as an association, we don't actually implement election administration, and we don't supervise. We're, like I said, we're a mechanism for information sharing, education, cooperation across the states, and we represent the state chief election officials in most cases. But you know, a big part of that role also is facilitating relationships with outside entities as well. I would say a big challenge for the entire election administration community. Like I said, the decentralization of elections, it introduces some resilience into the US election systems, because in many cases it makes it more challenging for an adversary to have a national impact if they were to breach a system, because maybe they're just breaching a specific local government system, or in some cases a state government system. But it does introduce some resilience to the process, but it also introduces complexity and challenges. And so a big challenge is just reaching all of the 8,000 plus local election officials and getting them involved in all of the intergovernmental coordination that's going on. We've seen since 2016 massively increased coordination across the 50 states and between the states and the federal government, and between states and their local governments in many cases, but bringing some of the smaller local election jurisdictions into the fold to be part of this constant communication and coordination has definitely been more of a challenge. So that's the challenge I'll focus on. It's definitely one of the biggest ones.
Let's move to the question. It is related to the Indonesian context. There's a question from Zuhdan. Is it possible for e-voting to be implemented in Indonesia while the development of e-governance in Indonesia is still low? Rank 88 UN e-government survey 2020. And also the digital literacy in society are still ranked among the lowest in the world. Do you see it? Is it possible for e-voting to be implemented in Indonesia?
So I'm not going to speak to Indonesia specifically, because I'm not as aware of your election systems and processes. What I will say, I'll speak to this from a US context, and I think it will be largely applicable to a lot of what I say will be largely applicable. So voting, actually casting votes over the internet, is something that most people involved in election administration in the United States see as an extremely high risk endeavor. And the Department of Homeland Security has come out with recent guidance that says just that, that it's extremely high risk. It's difficult to manage the cybersecurity risk to that type of process. Electronic vote casting in the United States, remote electronic vote casting, so casting a vote over the internet, it's extremely limited. So we have cases in which it is allowed within specific states, but it's extremely limited. And so states, again, have their own rules, but typically you see these processes only being allowed to certain voters in the military and overseas citizens who may not have other good options for casting a ballot. And in extremely limited cases, we've seen it offered to some voters with disabilities. And again, in extremely limited cases, it has been made available in emergency circumstances. So particularly for voters who may be displaced by a natural disaster, such as a hurricane or similar type of natural disaster, we've seen it being offered. But in these cases, it comes up to like the risk versus benefit calculation by the states, that they see it as a high risk endeavor from a cybersecurity perspective. But in some cases, they're choosing to that the risk is acceptable because it makes it easier for these individuals to vote. But again, I would say it's extremely limited, and my members, we don't as an association have a specific position on this, but my members see this as a high risk endeavor. I recently had a number of members asked about the expansion of some type of e-voting, and most of them just said that we don't have the means to secure that type of voting effectively, and so they didn't see any type of significant expansion as appropriate at this time.
Sebagai konteks untuk Miss Lindsay, di Indonesia akan ada 270 local election, akan ada 270 pilkada di daerah. Sejak pandemi COVID-19 ini tentu dorongan untuk menerapkan ada intervensi teknologi di dalam proses pemilu itu akan sangat-sangat banyak gitu ya, terutama soal e-voting. Tetapi KPU memilih menggunakan intervensi teknologi di dalam tabulasi, di dalam rekapitulasi elektronik. Mungkin ini pertanyaan terakhir untuk Miss Lindsay. Apa saran yang bisa disampaikan kepada Indonesia yang hendak mengadopsi teknologi di dalam tahapan pemilunya, terutama di dalam tahapan rekapitulasi elektronik gitu ya, untuk hasil pemilu? Apakah regulasinya yang perlu diperkuat, atau digital literasinya, atau mencari teknologi dan sistem yang baik, atau apa yang paling penting untuk di-address di dalam penerapan teknologi itu?
Was that a question? I'm sorry, I didn't get a translation.
Apa saran yang dari Miss Lindsay terhadap Indonesia yang akan menerapkan teknologi gitu ya di dalam rekapitulasi elektronik? Apakah regulasinya diperkuat, atau digital literacy dari pemilih itu diperkuat, atau memilih sistem atau teknologi yang digunakan yang paling secure gitu, atau apa yang paling
Yeah, we're still not getting a translation. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe the question is, what is your suggestion for Indonesia? For the context, Indonesia will conduct local election into 270 region, and after the pandemic, everyone pushed to use technology on the process of the election, and election official here in Indonesia choose to implement e-recapitulation or e-tabulation. What is your suggestion for us here in Indonesia who want to implement that kind of technology?
Again, I really don't want to speak to suggestions for Indonesia, especially because I'm not exactly sure what that technology is. But what I would say is, overall, we see any system, any technology as it's never going to be perfect, right? You have to assess the risks associated with it and choose if it is, if it's needed and if it's still appropriate to use based on that risk. And if you choose to use a particular technology, you have to look at that risk assessment and try to mitigate the highest risks associated with using that particular technology. What I would say related to voting during the pandemic, there are certainly challenges, and we saw that happening. We saw challenges during the early days of the pandemic when we had a lot of primary elections going on, to choose the candidates by the parties. And what's important is just to look at experiences of other places who have run elections and look at the lessons that they've learned. So early on, we held a couple of webinars with other countries who had recently run elections so that our members could hear about their experiences and their lessons learned. And I think the same thing will be important after our election for others to look to us to hear about experiences and lessons learned.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, for all your presentation and the answer to all of the question. Really appreciate. Bagi Bapak Ibu sekalian juga terima kasih buat yang sudah bergabung di dalam diskusi kita kali ini mengenai pemilu Amerika Serikat. Dan terima kasih juga atas pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang menggugah diskusi. Saya kira ini penting untuk konteks Indonesia yang tadi itu ya mulai ada dorongan untuk menggunakan teknologi di dalam tahapan pemilu. Tadi apa yang dikatakan oleh Ms. Lindsay Forsen sangat berguna sekali bagi Indonesia. Jadi perlu ada assessment yang sangat panjang untuk menentukan teknologi apa yang akan diterapkan di dalam di dalam tahapan pemilu. Juga tentu harus ada juga risk management untuk setiap pilihan-pilihan teknologi yang sudah dipilih gitu ya. Demikian mungkin Bapak Ibu sekalian, kita sudah ada di penghujung acara diskusi, sudah pukul 9. Sekali lagi terima kasih Ms. Lindsay, thank you for your presentation and all for your answer.
Thank you.
We wish you good luck for your election, a secure election. Terima kasih juga kepada Pak Leo Jilk. Thank you for Leo Jilk and all the folks in US Embassy for this great collaboration. Dari saya sekian Bapak Ibu sekalian, sampai ketemu lagi di diskusi-diskusi selanjutnya.